Masim?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Bezrat Hashem, we're going to do the second part right before the second parak, third bit of Shahar Daled of HaChayim. So we spoke about a lot of details about the history of Hasidut and the history of Rabbi Miskovitz, Rabbi Volozhiner, the Talmud of the Shagadari, the Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, and Aviyah Yeshivot. He's the person who really created the concept of Yeshivot the way we have it nowadays. So beforehand, it was like, in Sephardi countries was the same way. In Ashkenazi, in European countries, also the same way. The Rav of town, part of his job was to create shiurim for the Talmidim, and would come to the Beit Midrash and learn. And they slept wherever they slept, if they came from different places. But it was no systematic way of learning Torah the way we have it in the yeshiva system. Now, he was the one that was mechadish this concept, really, the way we have it nowadays. And much of his focus was stressing the chashivut of the Torah, obviously coming from the Geonei Olam like Shagadari and Vilna Gaon, how much they valued the learning and so on, and also added to it the movement of Hasidut in general, the Baal Shem Tov and the Mezritcher Rebbe, that they focused primarily in Avodat Hashem, on Tefillah and saying Tehillim and connecting with Hashem in every level that you're found in. And you don't have to necessarily know depths of the Tosafot and being able to so to speak, rip apart the Tosfos and put it back together. The Yichel Yaakov Weinberg writes in his at the end of his Shelot Shvuot Sridei Esh Chelek Daled, he wrote a whole kuntris on Baalei Musar, because he himself, if I'm not mistaken, he was the Talmud of the youngest Talmud student of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam, and he therefore firsthand experienced this. And he writes that before Rabbi Yisrael Salanter came, people would not, let alone that they would not go to the same shuls, they wouldn't sit on the same bench as an Amharit, so to speak, as a person that didn't know how to learn Talmud and Gemara and Tosafot and wasn't one of the Code Lamdanim. They would not be machshuv them in that way. So the avoda of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was to bridge this gap between the 10% at the most of the people who knew how to learn and the 90% of people who were Amcha, the regular layman, that they wanted Kirvat Elohim Litov, as David HaMelech says, I want to become close to Hashem, but there was no way left for them. And he brought this to them, that even the Lamdanim should be Baalei Midot and learn Musar and so on and so forth, which we spoke briefly last week. But you understand also why the Hasidut movement took Europe by wildfire. I mean, the majority of European from Jews, of the 2 million from Jews that they had before the Holocaust, were Hasidim. Because this spoke to everyone, that you could be wherever you are and speak to Hashem. You could be whatever you are and speak to Hashem. Hashem wants you the way you are, where you are. You could just, put your hands up, put your thing to Hashem and speak with Him, which is very much true. The Sephardim, on the other hand, we never had this problem. We always had the merge between them. It was, on one hand, the chashivut of the Torah. As I've been always researching the minhagim of different Sephardic kehillas, and especially with the focus on the Middle Eastern communities. And I came across a sefer that has different rabbanim from different places, and I found a piece on Hamadan. Sitting in Iran, I said the yeshiva, the yeshiva Ketana, the high school yeshiva, in order to enter, the entrance level was they had to know 400 block Gemara. It's like, wow, this is 150 years ago. So they had that level of greatness. In Tunisia was the same way. On the other hand, it was the unity and the love and warmth of the Sfaradim. So this problem was not presented in the same way in our communities, but again, nevertheless, part of what he writes here in Sha'ar Dalet, as we mentioned, is to combat that idea that Torah is not as important. You could do, you connect with Hashem through quote avoda, right? He says no. It's you have to emphasize on learning of the Torah and different elements of it. We'll see tonight. We'll see one specific element of the argument B'ezrat Hashem. So v'tchila, this is what he starts with. V'tchila asim divrati b'inyan esek haTorah lishma. Ma'u inyan lishma. So we talk about learning Torah lishma, right? The beginning of the sixth parak of Pirkei Avot. This is Rabbi Meir says, "Kol ha'osek b'Torah lishma zocher lidvarim harbe." If you learn Torah lishma, you have it. So what does it mean Torah lishma? So this became a very big machloket among the poskim, but you'll see, this already was approached by the Rishonim. So now let's read what he says. Ki gam zeh peri chatat lekama hamonim asmam mi'esek haTorah kedusha. This has become one of the causes why people do not learn Torah. Why? Bechoshvam, because they think inyan lishma perusho bedevekut kadol b'li hefsek. They think you have to be davek to Hashem, like really, really feel the essence of Hashem next to Shiviti Hashem Negi Tamid. And if you're not learning like that, so then it's not worth learning. If you can't learn Torah Lishma with devekut of Hashem, with being mindful of Hashem's presence in front of you every moment, then the Torah is missing something. And even worse than this, writes HaChayim, that if you're not learning Torah with devekut, with being attached to Hashem, it's nothing. Now, we don't want to diminish the value of devekut. Obviously, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Am Yisrael, says, "V'ata Yisrael ma'aseh b'chashval mimach." It mentions 5 things: Kim leirat Hashem, rahavat, larachat b'chol drachav, l'shmor mitzvotav, u'dov kabo. The pinnacle of avodat Hashem is to be davek to Hashem, right? Shiviti Hashem Nagi Tamid is a great and important thing. Shulchan Aruch starts with, it really is from Mor Nebuchim of the Rambam, but the Rambam brings it in Sif Aleph, Mamash Siman Aleph, Sif Aleph, Shiviti Hashem Nagi Tamid. It's a tremendous madriga, right? Ma'alot HaTzadikim Asher Olchim Lifnei Elokim. Because at the end of the day, you have to be mindful of Ribono Shel Olam at every step of the way. But at the same time, learning Torah is not necessarily diminished to nothingness if you don't have that, and that's the point that he's going to make. Now, this is an old machloket. Let's just finish this paragraph. I'll give you a very brief history of what happened exactly in the time of Rav Chaim. We'll appreciate more because this is just one side of the story, right? So writes Rav Chaim, לזאת, כשרואים עצמן שאין ליבם הולך לזאת המדרגה, when they see in themselves that they're not in the madriga of feeling Hashem's presence all the time, שיהיה לימודם בדבקות תמידי, that they will be able to learn at all times the same way that people who are davek to Hashem learn, לא יתחילו כלל ללמוד. They'll say, you know what? Throw in the towel. We give up. We're not going to even do it, right? ולא יתחילו כלל ללמוד. They're not going to start at all. ועל כן תפוג תורה חס ושלום. Because of this, the Torah is going to be destroyed. Because all of these thousands of people are not even learning. And the truth is, this is Gemara in Masechet Brachot, Daf Kaf Chet. The Gemara says that Rabbi Gamliel, he had a certain, I think maybe we alluded to this last week, that Rabbi Gamliel, the Nasi of Israel, he was very specific about who he allowed in the Bet Midrash. He had a Shomer Petach. They would only let in people who were Tocho Keboro, that they are really inside and out there the same way. I'm not sure exactly how he tests that, but people were unhappy about Rabbi Gamliel's conduct with Rabbi Yehoshua in 2 different elements. The Gemara there and Rashi bring the story of embarrassing him publicly for having disagreed and when Yom Kippur should fall and so on. So they say, you know what? Time to have some early retirement for Rabbi Gamliel. We'll choose someone else. It goes through a whole back and forth. Who's going to become next one? And they chose Rabbi Eliezer Azariah, right? So when Rabbi Eliezer came, he one of the things he did the first day was he was Mesalek Shomer Petach. He took the guard off, said everybody could come in. Everybody should come in. And Gemara says up to 700 benches, larger benches, so that, 10 people maybe on each one of them were added. Thousands of people we're talking about. And Gemara says that day, every single question that for years and years were hovering around the atmosphere of the Bet Midrash without answer, everything was answered. Even though that these people were Pshutei Ha'am. But that's the koach of the Torah when you have a lot of people come and learn. And well, maybe they were not Divekut B'Hashem. They were not in that level of, Tochol Keboro, whatever you understand, to be David, but that was the difference. And the Gemara is Muchach there. Gemara says they showed because Rabbi Gamliel got depressed. He was also, you see the Anava of Rabbi Gamliel, HaChayim Yisrael. He was not, Gemara says, he also came, even though that they put him down, and now this 18-year-old is the Nasi of Israel. He could be his grandson. But he came and he saw what happened. He went home, he was depressed. He said, maybe Khalila, Manati Torah Israel, maybe I stopped the Jews from learning. And Hashem showed him in the Chalom, right, an empty, ashes, to show him that these are not important. And the Gemara says, Velohi, it's not true. They showed him this in the dream just that he should not become depressed, he should not have a heart attack. But the methodology of Rabbi Gamliel was not as good as Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah was the correct way to let everyone in. So that's just one element of Torah Lishma that we have. But he says, מהמשך העניינים מתפאר אם ירצה השם ממילא מעלתה של תורה קדושה והאדם העוסק בה כראוי. לזאת ההכרח להביא קצת מאמרי חז"ל. So that's why I'm forced to bring some of the מאמרי חז"ל in Shas ומדרשים and Zohar, אשר בם ידובר נפלאות מעלת התורה הקדושה, that through it you'll see the greatness of the Torah, והעוסק בה, and people who learn it, וגודל שכרה ונמשך, and the greatness of the schar of the people who learn it, and חס ושלום vice versa. Hagam shkol elu ha'ma'amarim yedu'im u'mufursamim, even though these are all known things that I'm going to mention to you. It's not something that I'm mechadish, Gemaras and Zohars and so on. In kol zeh, kebatztim, I gathered them all together, lehalhiv libot ha'chafesim, lehitabek b'ahavat Torato Yitbarach. For those who desire to attach themselves to the love and the limud of the Torah, all hitlonen betzilah ha'elyon nora. Now, what is the history of this? My Rosh Yeshiva, Zatzal of Weinberg, which many of you know, Yaakov Weinberg, Noach Weinberg's brother, and both of them, they were Slanim Chasidim, right? And actually, what people don't know, most people, is that Rav Weinberg was supposed to be the next Slanim Rebbe. He was offered it and he rejected it. He did not want it. And then he obviously became the son-in-law of Ruderman, and after that, the Rosh Yeshiva of Ner Yisrael.
He was supposed to be after the Nesiba Shalom?
He was, yeah. So that's obviously a tremendous thing. Oh, this didn't start over. I thought it started. So, the first Slanim Rebbe, Rosh Yeshiva's great-great-grandfather, was Avram Mislanim, right? Avram Weinberg, same last name, right? Avram Weinberg, the first Slanim Rebbe, he wrote several Sfarim, but in his main sefer, he wrote very strong against the concept that the HaChayim is going to introduce to us. And he was one of the ones that wrote and held very strongly that Torah Lishma means with the Vekut. You have to learn Torah with the Vekut to Hashem. So if you're the Tehillim, you do the same thing, right? Torah is valued if it's learned Lishma. Now, I want to open a parenthesis on the importance of the Torah Lishma. The Ramchal writes in Derech Hashem Chelik Bet Perek Dalet, he writes that the greatest single shefa that exists in this world has been tied as a segula, as a davar seguli, to one of the tareg mitzvot. In other words, the background for it that's needed is that the world needs to be recreated every moment of the day, right? That's the difference between a bria and a yitzira, or asiya. Yitzira and asiya is yesh meyesh. You take something, you form it to something else, and it could outlive you. It could live forever. So that does not need me after I make it, because it existed before me. But a yesh ma'ayin needs me in order to exist, right? And therefore, every second, it needs me to exist every moment of the day. So Hashem is recreating, so to speak, the Maaseh Bereshit every single moment of the day. So what is that zchut, Talu? And it's a shefa of Bria, a creation is happening every moment. That shefa, says Ramchal, Hashem tied it to one of the Taryag mitzvot, one of the 600 billion. Which mitzvah is that? Limud Torah. It's the mitzvah of Limud Torah. Whenever you learn, you're creating that very shefa that creates and keeps up the world. Actually, the Maral writes in the beginning, towards the beginning of Netiva Torah, in his Sefer Netivot Olam, Maral writes the same thing in a different way. Maral asks, we say, Talmidei Chachamim marbim shalom ba'olam. Struck the Maral, what's the connection of Talmidei Chachamim with world peace? Like Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky was about politics. Anyway, he does. But the Gadol doesn't necessarily. What does he have to do with Marbim Shalom Ba'olam? So right, essentially the same thing. It says the world was created in a state of Shalamut. Right? There was no sickness, no death, no war, nothing. Until we messed up. When you sin, then that. And the Gemara says, "En mita below avon below yisurim below chet." There's no mita and yisurim, difficulty of any sort, without sin, without the concept of chet. So all of the suffering that you have, the wars, the sicknesses, the climate change, all those things are essentially talui on our masim. So writes the Maral, when you learn Torah, you're pushing the world to the creation, to the state of creation, because that's what brings the shefa of creation down. So therefore, you're marbeh shalom ba'olam. Rabbi Shlomo used to keep a very, very difficult schedule of learning, 18, 20 hours a day, learning even when he was much older. And he knew everything. He already, at age 12, when he got married, he knew half of Shas with Tosafot Baal Peh. He was one of probably the biggest talent in his generation. And yet, he was old, and he was learning. And so someone said, you know everything. Why are you pushing yourself so much? You know it already. I said, no, if I don't learn Torah here, if I'm mitrashel, if I let loose, someone in Italy is going to die. It's all connected. It's the shefa of the world. So that's the Chash. But then the Ramchal writes in the Hashem there, says, that is when you learn Torah Lishma with all of the things that Chazal say, with Koved Rosh and Retet and Ziyah, the less of that you have, the less shefa you bring down, until the degree that it says you could have a possible scenario that the person is learning Torah lekantir, like a Bible critic. And that brings zero shefa down. So that concept does exist, right? But nevertheless, Avraham Weinberg, the first Rebbe, he held that you don't have limud Torah lishma when you are not learning with the Vikut. So that's the problem. Okay. There's the other Sfar also. There's a sefer called Yosher Divrei Emet. It was very stark, very strong. That it means the Vikut, and he disagreed very much with Reb Chaim in the piece that we're going to see. On the other hand, there are many who wrote differently. Like, let's say, Yosher Divrei Emet that I mentioned, he said you can't learn Torah to enjoy it. You can't enjoy learning Torah. That's considered a lack of lishma. On the other hand, the Iglei Tal, who was one of the actual Hasidic Rebbes, he was Avram Misachichov. Avram Misachichov He has a very strong personality. So you probably know him as the Avnenezer, right? You've heard his name as Avnezer, and his Sefer on Shabbat, Yisodiot Sefer in Hilchot Shabbat. He was a very strong personality. He was. I'll tell you 2 stories about him. It's just interesting to know the strength of personality. He was supposedly 5-6 years old when one of the big Hasidic rabbis came to town, and everyone went to see them, greet them. Yeah. And he was like a kid, kidula. So he goes, he opens the crowd, he stands in front of the Rebbe, and he asks, he says, "What's your name?" Like, in second person. Right? What's your name? And the Rebbe says, you don't say ata, you don't say you to the Rebbe, you speak like that to the Rebbe. The Rebbe asks him. So he says, "What, you're bigger than Hashem? You say Baruch Ata?" So he says, Muftachani, this guy is going to be something special. So I'll tell you, when Shiva, as a Weinberg, got engaged with the daughter of Ruderman, right? So I think it was either in the engagement or the wedding. The wedding, he said the following. Ruderman said the following story. He said, when the Avnezer or Ram Sachchev was of age to get married, first it was read to the daughter of the sons of Rabbi Chaim, his sons, Divrei Chaim, right? Gaon of them, tremendous. So the minhag is always that the father gives a faher. The father of the girl gives a faher, gives a test to the son, see if he's a Talmud Chacham. Like, I want to give my daughter to you. I want to make sure you're a Talmud Chacham. Right? The Gemara says, "Lo'olam yiten adam kol ma sheyesh lo." You should give everything that you have. And that you should marry off your daughters to Talmud Chacham. Gemara says horrible things about someone that gives a daughter into Amaretz. Because in Pesachim, many other Gemara in Brachot. So he gives him a fire to speak for hours, and learning, and he's happy. He says, "Oh, good. So come tomorrow. We'll speak again." He says, No. You only get one bite on an apple." Chaim Sanzer was taken back. He says, "Why?" He says, "What's the pshat that you give me a fire?" Because of this Gemara. Chazal say you should give everything again, marry your daughter to Talmud Chacham. But the Gemara also says, you also have to marry a bat Talmid Chacham. So what's the pshat that the father-in-law gives the prospect Chatan a faher, and the Chatan doesn't get to faher the father-in-law? What's the pshat? The pshat is, you're somach on the faher that his father-in-law gave him. But if you're going to give me a second one, right, then I'm going to get to faher you too, right? So Chaim Sanzer said, "You're too sharp for me. It's not a good shidduch. Go to the Kotsk, the Kotsker Rebbe." Kotsker Rebbe was known as probably the biggest Iwi of the generation, but he was very sharp. There's everything was on the table, no consideration. And Kachava, he married, the Avnezer married the Kotsker Rebbe's daughter. So Rashi Zatzal said this story. He said, I heard Reb Weinberg once. That was more than enough. I don't want to do it second time. I'm afraid if he wants to fair me, So that's Reb Weinberg was known as Rashi Zatzal. Ruderman was known as never forgetting anything. It's not the time to tell these stories about him, but Reb Weinberg was known as a gaon, not necessarily in memory in that way, but in depth of his mind, it was legendary. So Avnezer Bekitzur, he writes in the Hakdama to the Sefer on Shabbat, in Metal, he speaks about Torah Lishma, and he very vehemently disagrees with this idea that you should not be able to have hana'ah and enjoyment from learning. He says, fakert, on the contrary, learning with enjoyment is part of learning. That is what learning is all about. If you enjoy the learning that he has to be about, right? I don't know why he doesn't bring Raya from the Gemara in Chagigah Daf Tetvav. The Gemara there says, just came to my mind, I never thought about it before. The Gemara there says that in the Brit Milah of Elisha ben Avuya, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shlomo are sitting learning. So you see that the essence of Torah Mar Sinai being given is with simcha, with dvarim smechin, has to be happy. But he brings actually a very lomdish raya. He brings a raya from the Gemara in Keretot. Right, by mistake it once says Kritut. It's Keretot. The Gemara there says in Daf Yutet, I believe, the Gemara says, Hamit asek bechalavim v'arayot chayav. Right? That if you eat chalev or chas shalom or engaged in arayot, b'mitasek, without kavana. Right? Mitasek, what's mitasek? You know, if you by mistake turn a switch on Shabbat, that's shogeg. Right? If you mamash are not thinking even and you do it, then it's even one level less. It's mitasek. So hamitasek bechelev and arayot. Gemara says you're chayav. Why? Sheken nehene, because you're nehene from it. Says the Iglei Tal that you see that the hana'ah is part and parcel of the avera, right? When you have hana'ah from it, even though that you had no kavanah, it's part. When you have hana'ah, it's part of the things. It says limud Torah also. The hana'ah is part of the mitzvah. It's not something separate from it. When you learn it, it's the definition of the learning of the Torah that you are doing. It's not something separate from it. So it says, Adarabah, you should be happy. Now, he didn't see the writings of one of the Rishonim, Rabbi Avraham min Har. Right? If you're familiar with this, it's one of the Kitvei Rishonim that was found after the time of Avnei Nezer. The time of Avnei Nezer, the world did not see this yet, because it was in Ktav Yad and then it was published afterwards. So in the writings of Rabbi Avraham min Har, you find exactly like the Chidush of Avnei Nezer from a different Gemara. He brings a raya from the Gemara in Nedarim. I don't remember exactly how he does it. I think it's Gemara in Nedarim, Daf Memchet. The Gemara says that if you make a neder that you don't want to be nana from Reuben, from this guy, right? So it says that person cannot use any of the Sfarim or Sifrei Torah that are Shayach to Kahal. So if it's the Sefer Torah of the Kahal, the Sfarim of the Kahal, this person who made the neder can't use those Sfarim, because partially belongs to Reuben too. And you having Hana from that is having Hana from Reuben, so it's Asur. So Frak, Rabbeinu Avraham min Har, he says, wait a second, what do you mean is Asur? I thought there's a klal, mitzvot, lav lehenot nitenu. Mitzvot are not given for hana, so therefore if you are nana from a mitzvah, it's not called hana. It's a very powerful question, right? So says Rabbeinu Avraham min Har, he says, no, that's only by mitzvot ma'asiyot. Right? You put on tefillin, so that's not mitzvot lav lehenot nitenu. Right, so if it's let's say a tefillin of Hekdesh, right, or whatever, so you could talk about, this is not considered being nehene from Hekdesh. It's a mitzvah, you did a mitzvah with it. But a mitzvah that it's meant for hana'ah, it's meant for enjoyment, then you have kavanah, it's for hana'ah. And that hana'ah is asur. You don't say mitzvot lav lehenot nitu in a mitzvah that part and parcel of the mitzvah is to have hana. It says limud Torah is that a type of mitzvah that's meant for hana. So it's beferush in Rabbi Avraham min Har, like the Avnei Nezer, and not like the Yosh Divrei Emet that I mentioned.
Right, based off this principle, if there's somebody who's learning a Masechet, it's not enjoyable for him, he's really not into it, would you advise him go to another Masechet that you enjoy more, go to a different topic?
Okay, that's a very good question. The Gemara says in Masechet Avodah Zarah Daf Yutet that this is the Gedolei Tanaim you're talking, Rebbe, that this was a question between learning Mishlei or Teilim, right? One of them wanted, and you switched the whole yeshiva. Why? Because Ein Adam Lomed, Gemara says, Ela b'makom shelibo chafetz. You have to learn something that you want, because otherwise it doesn't go in. When you're sitting there suffering, you don't like the topic, you don't enjoy the topic. But then there is another aspect of dedication to it, which is also true, that when you have, some sugyas are always hard. And it's not just I'm going to learn only things that I enjoy. Sometimes you bump into, you have to work it out. You have to, the amal of the Torah, the dedication to understanding, even when it's difficult, is a part of learning also. The shiur amilim b'Torah, the amal of the Torah, the working hard to understand, is part of the Torah as well. The HaChayim writes in Siman Kuf Nun Hey in HaChayim, he brings the Ari Kadosh. He says when Arizal used to learn, he would sweat because he was so involved to understand, to make sure. And he writes that is, he brings the words of the Zohar Kadosh, that when the parasha says in Shemot, right, ba'avodah kasha b'chomer u'bilbenim v'chol avodah b'sadeh, all of those words, each one of this is about Talmud Torah, right? Chomer zo kal v'chomer, says the Zohar, right? U'bilbenim says libun ha'sugya. Avodah kasha is the learning, says the Zohar Kadosh, and says he brings from Arizal that's how you break the klipot of the limud. When you have some serious stuff in the middle, there's a lot of covers on it, right? So you have to break through those klipot, those covers, in order to get to the gold in the middle. And the way you do it is by working hard, by being dedicated despite the difficulties. So both concepts are true, right? Both concepts are true. So now,
that'd be a question. Why didn't anyone bring the pasuk Pikudei Hashem Yishanim Mesamchei Lev?
okay, so that's a good question. That's a good question. It is a whole. Actually, he explains this like that. He explains that that's why it's asur to learn for Avel and for Tisha B'Av. The Avinezer explains it there, that because it's a totzah. But I'm assuming, even though that he doesn't necessarily say this, I'm assuming that the Sata Neged, the Yoshid Bnei Amet, and those who held like him, they hold that this is an outcome, a fringe benefit maybe, is totzah, but the kavanah cannot be that I'm doing this for a hana'ah. Also, if you come happy, fine, you figured out something. But to learn with the kavanah that I really enjoyed learning, right? That's a pasul hana. The more of it you could avoid, the better. Abinazar says no. At the country, you have to enjoy learning. It's part of the mitzvah to enjoy learning, right?
Are we equating Hanagya with Bekut? Is that
No. It's two different things. I'm just showing you the spectrum on this topic. We're seeing one side of it, but there's the side of the Yoshua Divrei Emet, and then there's the opposite side of that from the Iglei Tal, and then there's the side of Rabbi Abraham Weinberg, which he says basically is the Bekut, and he is coming to knock that concept, right?
And are we? It sounds like we're talking about learning in a state of the Bekut rather than for the sake of the Bekut. Meaning, when I'm learning to be Davek to Hashem rather than before I start learning, I need to make sure I'm Davek to Hashem. So this sounds like it's talking about before you start learning, don't think that you have to be Davek to Hashem. But some of the other stuff that we're discussing is, what am I learning for? Am I learning to get Hana'ah out of it, or am I learning to become Davek to Hashem? Is there like a distinction there?
Both of them are true, as we're going to see partially. He's going to discuss that. But you're correct, that in the Machloket of Dvekut, the major issue that he has, the major issue that Yesod HaAvodah is pointing, that's the Sefer of Rabbi Abraham Weinberg. He says this in a Sefer called Yesod HaAvodah. He's saying that no, it has to be that you're learning mitoch Dvekut. That's Torah Lishma, right? So that means at the time you have it. I mean, which really means before you are having that already at the time that you learn. And Reb Chaim Volozhin says no, absolutely not. And he's going to go to try to prove this now, as we see. But again, not everything of this is going to be our primary focus. I think it's kedai for us to have the global scope of seeing what was going on really in the time of Rishonim, how people view Torah Lishma, because all the Maharals and the Ramchals and even the things that we have here are very relevant. I should say that Reb Kook, Alav Shalom, Rav Yitzchak Kook, he in one of his works, amazing poetic work, he writes something that's really a mix of both of this. It says that the limud Torah has to be with a chefetz, with a desire to be davek to the aura of the Torah, to know the Torah, and the complexity of the vastness of all of the Torah knowledge, which is not the Vikud, but he also mentions it's important that it should be with that kavanah of having the desire to attach yourself to Ribono Shel Olam. Okay, so again, this is a much bigger thing. You could speak about this for hours and hours, but this, I think, gives the four main elements of what people, Gedolei Yisrael, looked at, both in the Hasidic world, which has its truth, as I mentioned, from Rav Kook, and also in the Litvish world, and in the world of the Rishonim, from Rabbeinu Avraham Minhar. Okay, Inyan Esek HaTorah, he starts in Perek Bet explaining this actually at length. Inyan Esek HaTorah Lishma, Ha'emet HaBarur, the truth is, Ki Lishma En Pirusho Devekut, Kemo Shesovrim Ata Rov HaOlam. Already in his time, Rov HaOlam, as I mentioned to you before, the European Jewry was taken by wildfire with Hasidut. We spoke to people because they wanted to attach themselves where they are. You know, not that I have to become a Gadol B'Torah and then only then I could become connected to Hashem. He sold this concept. He sold very well, and you see it even nowadays that many people connect with Hasidut versus with Lomdit and complexities of halacha and so on and so forth. So he says, Rov HaOlam think that's the Vikud, but it's wrong. It's not true. Share Amru Razal b'Midrash. In Midrash Tehillim they said, oh, this is a gishmak. שביקש דוד המלך, עליו השלום מלפניו יתברך, שהעוסק בתהילים יחשב אצלו יתברך כאילו היה עוסק בנגעים ואוהלות. The Midrash is in the very beginning, in Perek Aleph of Tehillim, in Shochar Tov is the Midrash Tehillim, that David HaMelech asked Hashem that his work, his Tehillim, whenever you're osek in Tehillim, should be considered as the equivalent of the most complex parts of the Torah, which is Nigayim V'Ohalot, right? So it says Reb Chaim, a big chidush. Haresh ha'esek ba'alachot ha'shas. He first says that you see that esek, in learning halachot of Shas, be'iyun ve'yegiah, with hard work and toiling, who inyan yoter na'aleh ve'ahuv, is more beloved in front of Hashem, ma'amirat Tehillim, from saying Tehillim. Why? Because he's asking that this should be like that. But hold on 1 second. Ve'im nomar shelishma perushot devekut dafka. And if we say that lishma means only devekut, v'rak bazet halui kol ikar inyan esek HaTorah, and the whole esek HaTorah is only valid if you have devekut, so then who cares? You have devekut through what? The end result, the Vikud should be the barometer. And if I could connect with Hashem through Tehillim, it should be even better than learning Nigayim V'Ohalot. Why is he asking that this should be considered like that? You see? When you ask that Hashem, please, my Tehillim should be like Nigayim V'Ohalot, that means Nigayim V'Ohalot is up here. If the only value of Nigayim V'Ohalot is because of the Vikud, first of all, why Nigayim and Ohalot and not other things, other parts of the Torah? Secondly, why would Tehillim be less? If you're learning Tehillim with the Vikud, it should be the same thing anyways. So what are you asking for? Right? But then he says something very mechudash. Halo en Devekud yoter nifla ma'amirat Tehillim. There's not no Devekud like saying Tehillim. It's amazing. It's beautiful. V'gam mi yodea, this is the chidush. Mi yodea im hiskim HaKadosh Baruch Hu al yado bazeh. Who knows if Hashem agreed with him in his bakasha? So when I learned this the first time many years ago, my right away objection was, wait a second, so if Hashem didn't agree with him, why does the Midrash say it? And the Midrash says this without any cholek, without anyone that argues. It says Hashem, David HaMelech asked for this. So if Hashem didn't listen to him, what's the point of saying it to me? Why? It's misleading, right? So I had trouble with understanding it. Now you'll see he bevorns this. This is Chaim Volozhiner. he brings this question, he addresses this question right away. He says, "Ki lo matzinu b'divrehem zal mat tshuva heshiv lo yitbarach al she'elato." We don't find in Chazal what answer Hashem gave him, right? And then he says the example. He says, "Kemo shematzinu b'Bava Batra daf Yudzayin Amud Aleph ve'idach ha'uracha minyin hudekabai." He doesn't say what the Gemara says, so I'll tell you what the Gemara says. The Gemara there says at the very end of first perek of Bava Batra, like literally the last few lines, the Gemara says, Tarabana, I think the Gemara says, brings it right up, that 7 people, lo shalat bahem rima v'tolea. The 7 people who their body stayed intact, never rotted, never was damaged with rima v'tolea, with worms. What are they? Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, and Binyamin. Okay? And then the Gemara brings psukim for each one of them, and then the Gemara says, V'yesh omrim, that those who say, also David. How do you know? Because the pasuk says in Tehillim, Af besari yishkon labetach, that my flesh, yishkon labetach, should sit, rest assured that nothing's going to happen to it. And the other mandamar, who says only 7, not 8, Ve'idach, the other mandamar held, Ha'urachamenu, this is the language of the Gemara, Ha'urachamenu the kabai. He was asking, doesn't mean that Hashem provided it. So he says, you see from here that not everything that David HaMelech asked came through. Right? So that addresses my question, but I don't think it answers it fully. I could speak with confidence because of what I'm going to tell you in a minute. But I don't know if it fully answers, because there's a big difference between these two. What's the difference between the two? Over here, the Gemara says there's machloket. The major Tan Rabbanan says there's only 7, so David HaMelech is not part of it, right? Then there's the Yeshomrim because he found the pasuk. So Tan Rabbanan is not impressed with it. Yeah, but that's the tefillah. So it's machloket already in the Amoraic work, if not in Tanaic works. But Midrash Shochatov, there's no cholek. The Midrash just says it like that. And if you tell me it didn't happen, that's very misleading, the Midrash. So still you have a chiluk. But then I found the Rebbe of Ramban, right? Of all people, Rabbeinu Yehuda ben Bar Yakar, in his Perush Tefillah in Baruch Shamar, he actually says, don't think that these Morim of Tehillim don't take them lightly. They are as important as Nikaim Ba'alot, and he brings this midrash. So he says it like Pashut. This to him is not even a question that this was answered by Hashem positively. By the way, once we read the Baruch Shamar and get the Pesukei Zimra, the Sefer HaEshkol says that the Pesukei Tehillim are the most important. In other words, the Pesukei Zimra and the Sefer HaEshkol were only consist of the Ashrei and the 5 halakhot, and the rest of it is additions to it. Why is this important? Because we all know what in this day and age, we know what you could skip, right? Because everyone is in a rush to have a quick tefillah. So, if you're late, or if you're davening in a certain minyan that's very fast, and if you sneeze, you missed. So, you could daven the Ashrei first, first halukah, third halukah, fifth halukah. If you have not enough time, then just the 3rd and the 5th, or just the 5th, and then you go to Yishtabach. Everyone knows. But what if you have more time, right? So many people, what they do is they do the 3rd and the 5th, and then they do Vayvach David, or they do Az Yashir, and then they do Yishtabach. Right? So the truth is, doing the 5 halukas is the most important. Because that is the ikar of Pesukei Zimra. And then comes the rest. So if you have a little bit more time, but not enough time, really you should do all the 5 halukas, and then go to Yishtabach and skip Vayvach David and Az Yashir.
Are you allowed to go back?
If you have more time, you're saying so. Moshe Sternbach has a tshuva on that in I think HaGimel of his tshuva, and he goes back and forth of whether or not and how you would do that. And this does happen for when you miscalculated and you see, I have more time, or you wanted to sing the last halukah with everyone because it was Purush Yatzur, no one was singing with him, and now you want to do the last one and then come back to do the thing. So that also happens for compassionate individuals. So that's really a diyun there. It's less than pashut. So
Doesn't the Mishnah Berurah say the Seder Tefillah is not Yaakov?
yeah, but again, this gets into Kabbalistic things as well. For instance, you have the HaChayim that says that if you miss and then you come back to the thing, it's mekatses b'netiyot. He writes in Siman Nun Vav, Nun Bet, sorry. He writes that it's an offense. Even Lagabe, actually, it's Fiat Omer. Rabbi Shlomo writes in the first chelak of his Tshuva by HaChayim in Siman Hey, he has a whole Tshuva. If you daven with Ashkenazim, right, then what do? Because they say Sfirat HaOmer technically before Al Shabbat, right? So should you count Omer with them and then say Al Shabbat, or should you take the chance that maybe you're gonna forget, just try to make some simon for yourself and say Al Shabbat first and then count Omer? And he says you should say Al Shabbat first and then, so because these are all Kabbalistic things, and you're changing the order of Olamot. It gets into more complex things when you enter the world of mysticism. But all those, as a side note, he says, Rabbi Yehuda ben Yakar says this, and I found also in Maran Chida, in his Perush on Tehillim, Yosef Tehilot it's called. In the very beginning, he counts all the ma'alot of Tehillim, and one of the first things that he says Limut Tehillim, saying Tehillim is considered like learning Negaim ve'ohalot. So he also understood the Midrash. He understood the Midrash that David HaMelech's Bakasha was fulfilled by Hashem. So when I saw it, I felt more comfortable to stick to my guns. That you could also say Misvara, like I said, that there's no point for the Midrash to say it if it really wasn't. It's not the same thing as the Gemara in Baba Batra. But be as it may, he says that who knows that it was actually fulfilled, the Bakasha of David HaMelech. Okay. V'gam ki haya dai le'inyan hadevekut b'masechet achat. If it was, only point was the vekut, so just take one masechta and just go over it and over and over and over again. Why does it have to be that you should know the whole Torah? Now, this is also not so pashut, because the shiur says in Siman Mem Vav, when it speaks about the Birkat HaShachar and Birkat HaTorah, shiur says that why do you say two brachot? Obviously, the Gemara says the Machloket, and Rav Papa says Hilkach Nimnu Lekulam, right? Which, by the way, Rav Papa always says this, and he's always the one that makes peace. Is this and is this is okay? We'll do both of them, right? But the shiur says a deeper meaning of it is, when you say the first bracha of Asher Kedusha Mishtav Sivana Al Divrei Torah, Olas Divrei Torah, is one element of learning Torah. And when you say the second bracha is a different element, because there are two elements in learning Torah. One element of learning Torah is to know the entirety of the Torah, because if you don't know it, you can't do it. And that's why he writes the shiur, the ladies also make Birkat Torah, even though that they're patur from mitzvah Talmud Torah. Mitzvah Talmud Torah is mitzvah Shazman Grama, right? V'agita bo yomam v'layla is all, it's time bound basically. Each one of them is a different, and therefore the shiur says they should say it because they have the mitzvah of knowing the mitzvot that they have to do. In their Shabbat, all the lotases that they have to do is 365. And many of the asses, many of the positive mitzvot that they're chayav to do, they have to learn about them. But then there's the second element, that even if you know all the Torah, right, you still have to learn Torah. You still have to learn because it's a mitzvah. One of the Torah mitzvot is to learn Torah. V'agita bo yomam v'layla. You have to learn, despite the fact of your knowledge of the rest of the Torah, right? I think I mentioned the Yerushalmi Peh last week. The Yerushalmi Peh says, I don't know if I did. The Yerushalmi Peh in Perek Aleph Halach Aleph says that they asked Rabbi Yeshua if you could learn the Chochma Yavanit, whatever that means, or Sifanim Chitzonim, right? And he said, yeah, you could. When it's not day and it's not night, you could learn it. Because it says, right? And you have to learn. And again, this ties into the machloket of Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli in Menachot. Did we speak about this at all? So whether or not this this really is a mitzvah that you have to do mamash every second, or is it has a minimum like Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli that says Kriyat Shema morning and night? But ladies, according to Tur, say that, so you could say actually that this would answer Reb Chaim's question over here. You'll see it a little bit more. Let's read 2 more lines, and then we'll see how it actually could answer Reb Chaim's thing. So it says Reb Chaim, ולא מצינו לרז"ל, ולא כן מצינו לרבותינו זיכרונם לברכה, because in Masechet Sukkah, in Daf Chavchet it is, in Masechet Sukkah, the Gemara says, the Shevach of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that he knew everything. He didn't leave anything that he didn't know, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a Nasi of Israel. He was the most insignificant student of Hillel, out of the 80 students that Hillel had, 80 main students that Hillel had, but nevertheless he knew everything, says the Gemara. So it says Reb Chaim, right? Sha'amru al Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, shelo hiniach mikra mishnah halacha halachot ve'agadot, and all these things he knew. V'hainu kim meha'aloto al libo tamid. He teaches, he explains the Gemara. Why did he know everything? Because he always thought to himself, ki adayin lo yatzai de chovat esek Torah lishma, because he hasn't yet done fully Torah lishma b'mesh lamad adata, until now what he's learned, he has to learn more. Lezot haya shoket kol emav lehusif lekach tamid. He was always learning more, right? Miyom leyom musha mishlasha. So I would just ask on this that it's could be answered, this thing, with the thing that we mentioned from the Tur, that there are 2 elements of learning Torah. The first element, you're correct, the first element is knowing the entirety of Torah. You have to know what you have to do. How can you not learn Hilchot Shabbat and learn Hilchot of Korbanot that's not even Nugeh now, there's Kodshim and Tarot, and you're being Mechadel Shabbat? You have to know the halachot, right? After you finish all of the knowledge of the Torah and you make sure to retain it, that you're not forgetting, you're not getting rusty on Sheyah, Chazara, Bishul, this, that, 3 Machloket Tanai, then you could focus only on one part because you have a mitzvah of Talmud Torah, daily learning. That you could just take one Masechta and learn it, thousands of times. So that would answer the question, because you can no longer ask, well, he did that for learning Torah Lishma, but rather he did it because he had to finish knowing the entirety of Torah, because you have to do it. That's why he didn't leave anything that he didn't know. So that would be the question. And perhaps you could get out of it, but it's certainly a question, nevertheless.
Baruch.